Hi there. Welcome to Partners MOOC and Client Survey Program. My name is Jose Castillo and I will be here helping you to understand how to obtain a representative sample. First, we have to understand what a representative sample is. Essentially, let's try to imagine that we have a population between 200,000 and 300,000 people, right? To obtain information through a survey or through an interview from all of these people, it's going to be very costly and time-consuming. So to reduce these factors, we have to obtain a representative sample. Essentially, a representative sample is obtaining a subset of a larger population that reflects the essential characteristics of this population. Again, this helps minimize the cost and the time that we have to take to conduct this research. So to obtain a representative sample, what we do is we base the selection process focusing on a subset from the large population. Again, this helps reduce the factor of bias and again, time and cost efficiency. So basically what this does is it also helps to generalize information to this larger population that was previously mentioned. We have two types of samples. We have probability samples and we have non-probability samples. In probability samples, basically what we do is we take the samples through a random selection process. We have simple random samples. Simple random samples are chosen based on a factor of randomness. Let's imagine an example. Let's say we want to obtain a popular opinion from the public. Since obtaining each individual's opinion is going to be, again, time-consuming, what we do is we base on a simple criteria, and that is, for example, focusing or basing on the last digit of their population's ID number. Based on that, we obtain their opinion and we have a scope of a general population's opinion. Now, let's continue to our next sample that we have, stratified sample. Basically, a stratified sample is, again, a large population that we subdivide into groups based on a certain criteria. For example, we divide a population into men and women or ages between 20 to 65, and these will be our strata. And based on these, we take our representative sample and we continue with our research. Let's continue to our last and third sample that we have, cluster samples. Now, cluster samples are very similar to stratified samples with the difference that the researcher doesn't have a direct criteria or focus in the group. These groups or these subsets are already predefined naturally. An example, I focus my investigation or my research on a population from a building or from a neighborhood, and I conduct my research based on these subsets. Let's continue to our second category of samples that we have. We have non-probability samples. Now, these type of samples are closely related to the researcher's specific criteria, and based on these criteria will the samples be collected. The first type that we have are intentional samples. Now, these are the samples that the researcher believes are to give him or her the best results. The second type of samples that we have are convenient samples. Now, these samples are those that are readily available at hand to the researcher or those in their immediate context. The third type of samples that we have for non-probability samples are consecutive samples. Basically, these are the samples that are part of an ongoing process, which the researcher goes from one subset of a group to another subset of a group and compiles the information to be later analyzed. Now, we have our fourth type of samples, which are quota samples. Basically, a quota sample is a combination between a stratified sample and an intentional sample. What the researcher does is they choose a group to interview, but these groups belong to a predefined or pre-existing group that are also divided into strata. Then, the researcher focuses on these groups to ensure representativity. Let's continue on to the next part that we have. Now, there are some conditions that must be followed for a sample to be considered representative. The first condition that we have is the sample has to be random. So it's the factor of randomness. This ensures that the information that we gather can be generalized to a larger population. It ensures generalizability. The second condition that we have is that there has to be a factor of sufficient size. Now, for a group to be considered as sufficient size, let's take the example of a population. Let's say we have a population of around 100,000 people, right? A sufficient size group could be considered between approximately 300 people regarding to this population. If the size is too small, then it cannot ensure the general population's characteristics. And if the size is too large, then it's going to be too time-consuming and challenging logistically. The third condition that we have is homogeneity and diversity. This basically means that the groups that are being researched, there has to be a factor of diversity within them, but they have to have a similar characteristic. For example, if we're analyzing the minimum wage in the context of Ecuador, the minimum wage is around $500 to $600 dollars. So in this group that is being studied, I cannot consider a person to be a participant if he or she has a salary of more than $5,000 or $10,000 a month, because they do not share the same characteristic. The next condition that we have that must be followed is independence of selection. Basically, this means that the researcher does not have a first-hand take on which individuals are being selected to be observed. The last condition that must be followed is accessibility and feasibility. Basically, accessibility refers to the access that the researcher has to the population that is being researched, and feasibility refers to the data collection process that must be feasible regarding the available resources at hand. Now, let's go on to the next topic, which is why it's important to use a representative sample. First of all, there are advantages to using a representative sample. The first advantage that we have is efficiency in time and cost. For example, let's say you want to make a census of a population. A census is too expensive and consumes too much time. So basically, what's better to do is to use a sample of a population, which again helps us generalize the information that we want and is time efficient for us, and it's cheaper. The next advantage that we have is the possibility of generalization. Through a sample that we collect, we can relate this information from the samples to a larger population and relate these characteristics to the rest. And the next advantage that we have is deeper analysis. The advantage that this represents is that through the research that I conduct, I can be provided more deeper and meaningful information that I had initially intended at first, which provides a richer results in the data collection process. And now the last advantage that we have is measurable error. So if conducted properly, if calculated properly, we can have a margin of error, which would allow me to correct any mistakes that I have made in my initial assumptions, which in turn would help me provide a more rich and meaningful and more accurate estimate. And with this, we end this topic of how to obtain a representative sample. Let's continue learning in the next topic.